sort through all the fat on the posterior abdominal wall, look at kidneys, look at the blood supply and venous drainage of kidneys, find ureters and gonadal arteries and veins, look at the big old inferior vena cava and the various branches of the abdominal aorta. It's a fairly straightforward dissection. It's mostly, like I say, sort of carving out bits of fat. And just, be a little careful because sometimes you might not, some structures are, a lot of the structures are going from the middle of the abdomen down into the pelvis, and they're going in roughly the same direction. So be a little careful when you're sorting out veins, arteries, and ureters. Okay, so back to our friend, the peripheral nervous system. Today we're talking about the peripheral nervous system of the abdomen. In the end, I'll talk a little bit about referred pain, which gets rather interesting in the abdomen. Yes, it's very interesting in the abdomen. Okay, so a lot of this is review, just to hammer in the same old stuff that we tried to hammer in before exam 1. So there is, in the nervous system, in its broadest sense, there is the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And that is distinct from the peripheral nervous system, which consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves and their various branches. The peripheral nervous system, in turn, is divided into somatic structures, striated voluntary muscle in the body wall and various connective tissues. And the somatic nervous system has sensory components, which obviously is how you feel things, and motor components, which make these striated muscles do things. And we're talking about in the body wall, so they make your biceps flex so you can move your arm, or they make your abdominal muscles contract so that you can do all your sit-ups every morning. Then there is the visceral nervous system, okay, which is concerned with smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. These are, as well as various structures in the body wall, inside the body cavities, thorax and abdomen, and a few things in the body wall, particularly the little muscles that cause the hair on the back of your neck to stand up, and sweat glands and other types of glands. But much of this, visceral system obviously is guts and stuff like that. Okay, the visceral system has a sensory component, visceral sensory, and a motor component. And that motor component, which we refer to as the autonomic nervous system, has two parts, the sympathetics and the parasympathetics. This is so far what we learned in the thorax. It's all still true. The somatic nervous system in the abdominal region is essentially the same as the thorax. They're just different structures. Okay, so the intercostal muscles that you run across in the thorax, have sort of the same innervation as the abdominal muscles that were lining the abdomen. And likewise, the somatic sensory, when you feel things on the side of your thoracic wall, works pretty much the same way as when you feel things on the outside of your abdominal walls. That's the easy part. And just to review, the somatic motor neuron, okay, has its cell body in some part of the central nervous system. The ones we've seen mostly are obviously in the spinal cord. Okay, there's the cell body, there's an axon, and it sends a signal down this axon to, for example, a muscle, and then that muscle does what it's supposed to do, which is contract. Somatic sensory neurons, again, they have a cell body that is not in the central nervous system, but it's sitting out there, right, in that dorsal root ganglion. But it has a single axon that picks up some sensory information out here in the body and travels all the way back where it synapses in the central nervous system and says, help, help, you've cut your finger. This is all stuff that we learned about and had exams on during the thorax. There is a single neuron involved in somatic motor and somatic sensory innervation. So here's an example, okay, in the abdominal body wall, say, external abdominal oblique, for example, okay. So, or there are cell bodies here in this ventral horn, right? They go out the ventral root, go into the spinal cord, and then some parts go in the dorsal ramus to, say, back muscles, parts of the rector spinae down here in the lower part of your back, and others parts go into the ventral ramus and can come around and do these abdominal muscles that you've dissected out. And likewise, somatic sensory from the body wall. For example, if you're feeling something, if you sort of, poke your belly here, the sensation comes up here. The cell bodies are here in this dorsal root ganglion. The cell body is not a synapse. And the rest of the axon continues on, and synapse is here in this dorsal horn in the spinal cord. And so there's sensory information zooms down and you feel and say, oh my God, there's a pin sticking in your back. Okay, so nerves to the abdominal wall, body wall, are pretty much like the intercostal muscles that we saw up in the thorax. The main difference being they are not between ribs, right? So nerves to the abdominal body wall, some of the upper ones actually do or start off as intercostal muscles. And then down here, they spread out and innervate parts of the abdominal wall. And you've dug out some of these. So these up here are in fact intercostal muscles. And then below, so this one is between, on the underside of T11, between the 11th and the 12th rib. And then below that, there's another one, a ventral ramus coming around, which is below T12, so it's called the subcostal. And then there's L1, which comes out and then splits into two named nerves, because they're both L1, the iliohypogastric and the ilioinguinal, which you should have dissected or tried to find when you did the anterior abdominal wall. Okay, so these are innervating these muscles on the anterior abdominal wall that you saw, as well as the skin over the abdomen on all sides. Okay, so remember, unlike the arteries, remember the arteries in the thorax, there was an anterior origin and a posterior origin for these intercostals. The nerves all originate in the back. Okay, so here's an intercostal nerve coming down here, and then as you get below below rib 12, you have other nerves that are coming down and innervating. These are going around, are under the ribs, so they have to have these processes that come out and go around. Once you get down here on the abdominal wall, where there are no ribs, they can just sort of come out and innervate the skin and the muscles on the anterior abdominal wall. And you saw a few of those when you were skinning the anterior abdominal wall. Reviewing a mid-thoracic spinal nerve, right? So here in the spinal cord, you have a dorsal horn and a ventral horn. So you've got a dorsal root coming out of here and a ventral root coming out of here, going to form a spinal nerve. Sitting on top of it is this dorsal root ganglion. The spinal nerve then splits into dorsal and ventral rami. The dorsal ramus just goes up and does these deep back muscles that we dissected in the first couple of days, as well as the skin overlying them. The ventral ramus continues down and becomes an intercostal nerve, but there's all this sympathetic stuff, right, coming out, the sympathetic preganglionics coming out through the ventral, with the ventral root here, sending preganglionics down into the sympathetic ganglion at each of these thoracic vertebrae, and well, from T1 down to L2. Then there's a gray ramus coming back, And then the sympathetics go out both the ventral and dorsal rami, and then the ones in the ventral come all the way around. This ventral ramus comes down, splits, and sends a lateral cutaneous branch that goes to the outside to do this skin, then comes all the way around and flips under and sends another branch out here, okay, another lateral branch from the front that goes around and provides innervation to the muscles here in the thoracic wall and also the skin on the outside. Much the same. Here's the 10th, and it's much the same situation that we saw before. Again, in the abdomen, the same thing we saw before, except you don't have ribs there. So below T11, you've got the subcostal below T12, and L1 has two parts, the hypogastric and ilioinguinal. Sometimes they split well back in the posterior abdominal wall. We'll see pictures later. Sometimes they come out on the side and split later. And again, just as the thoracic nerves sort of wrap around from back to front and go from high to low, for example, at the belly button, we're dealing with T10. So, you know, your 10th thoracic vertebra is probably about right here, but the nerves come down, so T10 innervation is low, T11 is even lower, and so forth. And here, you don't have these ones that are below the ribs are no longer intercostal nerves. Okay, so the subcostal nerve comes out below the 12th rib, and then below that, on the back wall, when you dissect things away, you'll find L1, and like I say, it splits into two named nerves, because you can't call both of these L1. You can call them both L1, but you're missing some information. So the upper one is the iliohypogastric, and then the lower part of it is called the ilioinguinal, and then below that, there's a whole series of nerves coming out of this thing called the lumbar plexus, which we generally don't deal with, because it's providing innervation to the lower extremity. Some of the dissection, and the dissection guide for the medical students has them identify some of these nerves, and they're in your dissector, but we don't hold you responsible for the stuff in the dissection, although we'll give you a prosection sometime in your future. So here's the dermatomes. Again, that's what I was mentioning. On the back, everything's fairly straightforward, T1, T2, so T1 pretty much where just below the first thoracic vertebra, and T2, L, T10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these dermatomes sort of slide down as they come forward. So whereas T10 on the back is here, on the anterior surface it's way down here. So your upper extremity is getting innervation from lower cervicals in T1, and then when you get down into the lumbar region, the lower extremity is getting its innervation from all these lumbar and first sacral. Okay, back again to visceral, the visceral nervous system. Okay, visceral nervous system of the abdomen. In the body wall, it's pretty much the same thing. There's not a lot of visceral nervous system going on in the body wall, just running sweat glands and these erector pili muscles. And but the abdomen and the visceral nervous system is a very different story. Okay. Motor, our friend the autonomic nervous system, down here. Remember sympathetics and parasympathetics? Remember, both of these are two neuron systems, not like the somatic motor system. There are preganglionics in both of them and postganglionics. Okay, the synapse in between. Sympathetics, we dealt with extensively. They have preganglionic cell bodies, come out of that intermediolateral column between T1 and L2. They come out with the ventral rami, and then they synapse on these paravertebral ganglia in the thorax area. And then remember, there are these paravertebral ganglia all the way down. Even though the preganglionics only have a limited origin, there are paravertebral ganglia all the way down that we'll talk about, go to the body wall. Parasympathetics, again, we talked about this in the thorax. The preganglionics have preganglionic cell bodies are in two places. Many of them are in the brain, and we'll spend much of the rest of the course talking about some of those. And then there's another source down here in the sacral region, S34 or sometimes S234. The postganglionic cell bodies of these parasympathetics are in the walls of the organs, or down in the pelvic region, which we don't deal with. There's some tiny little ganglia, but by and large, you will not see postganglionics or the origins of postganglionics or the synapses between the preganglionic and postganglionic parasympathetics in the course of your dissections. And this autonomic nervous system, visceral motor at least, the visceral part, are a 2-neuron system. Oh, I thought I was going to get a picture. Oh well, we have no movements, no video. Okay, so the cell bodies, right? The basic is the cell bodies are in the central nervous system, somewhere either in the brain or the spinal cord. The ones we've seen so far have been in the brain. They come down and they go all the way down to synapse, okay, and then they go down to whatever they're doing their job. So there's preganglionics and postganglionics. When you're talking about visceral motor, you have to ask, where's the preganglionic cell bodies? Okay, where's the postganglionic cell bodies? And what's the pathways that the preganglionics take in order to synapse with the postganglionic? And where does the postganglionic go to get to the structure that's being innervated? So we're talking about visceral motor. Okay, so let's deal with our friends, the sympathetics, again, which we've seen a lot about. The preganglionic sympathetics are between T7 and L2 levels. What? That's supposed to be T1. Whoops. T1 and L2 in the medial, to the abdomen, I'm sorry. In the abdomen.